All right. Well, welcome to the second panel discussion. My name is Joe Bast. I'm the president of the Heartland Institute. When I started the Heartland Institute 29 years ago, I think the course of the manner of debate and dialogue on public policy, I think, was a little more polite and a little more balanced than it's become over the course of those years. I don't know if any of you legislators have noticed it as well in your legislatures. When I first started attending NCSL meetings, I think maybe the ratio of Republicans to Democrats was maybe 1 to 3 or 2 to 3, and at ALEC it might have been just the reverse of that. Maybe a third of the legislators at ALEC would have been Democrats. I think this year I saw fewer Democrats at ALEC and fewer Republicans at NCSL than at any time before. And a lot of the discussion just seems to be going right past each other. There's not a lot of engagement. When there is engagement, I'm afraid it's not very civil. I think some of that comes out of Chicago, and I apologize for that. We had Saul Alinsky, the famous organizer, and he had his rules for radicals, and that is the rule book that a whole generation now of community activists have been using. And part of that rule book is not listen to your opponents, or take them seriously, or treat them with respect. You don't see that in rules for radicals. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's demonize and isolate, freeze them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've unfortunately over the last year or two ourselves have had to look at that guidebook to figure out what the other side is doing to us, and have been kind of provoked into trying to respond to some of those tactics. Nowhere has the debate been more polarized than on environment topics. Heartland has been engaged in environmental issues ever since its beginning. In the 1990s, we published a book titled Eco-Sanity, a common sense guide to environmentalism, and looked at a whole wide range of environmental issues. It sold really well. We did a series of seminars in state capitals all across the countries. They were well attended. I think there was excellent debates about recycling and ozone and climate change, which was just an emerging issue back then. And we sparked some really good debate, and I think actually ended up changing some public policy. In 2003, we started to address climate change more specifically and more repeatedly. And we did what most think tanks would do. We did a policy study on the cost of reducing emissions and what the choices were for states. We worked it out for all 50 states and what the cost per ton was and how many tons the state would have to reduce their emissions in order to meet the Kyoto Protocol, and estimated the total impact on economic development and jobs and state treasuries. And I'm sure you all saw that study in 2003, and it changed public policy. It didn't. Everybody ignored it. It just disappeared down this black hole. We had done all this research. I mean, it was 6 months of really intense research. The study got no attention. And when we tried to find out why, we discovered that when people are racing for the exits because they think the building is on fire, they're not going to stop and debate the most cost-effective way to put out the fire, or debate whether or not we can afford to bring the police department here. People thought it was a scientific fact that climate change was a crisis and that we needed to act immediately. So we decided to take a look under the hood at this movement called global warming and look at the science, and commissioned a large group of scientists to conduct research. We've held 9 international conferences. We've published half a dozen books, 24 policy studies. We have distributed over 3 million books and booklets, more than 2 million videos. We've done a lot of work on climate change. And much of it you would have seen as elected officials. Every state legislator was sent Roosters of the Apocalypse, which was a recent book that we did by Raheel Isaac on some of the leaders of global warming alarmism. You might also have received the Mad, Mad, Mad World of Climatism. This was sent to every state legislator in the United States. We actually distributed 100,000 copies of this book. Very interesting, very entertaining. The guy really knows what he's talking about. Steve Gorham is an excellent speaker, and if you're looking for somebody to come in and make a presentation to a committee or to your constituents, consider contacting us, and we can put you in touch with Steve Gorham. And various policy studies, booklets like 10 Principles of Energy Policy. Additional copies of this are available on the table back there. And again, if you want multiple copies, this works really well with constituents. We've distributed over 100,000 copies of each of the 10 booklets in this series. So if you want 50 of them for an event that you're holding, just give us a call. And we can almost always send free copies of all of our publications to elected officials. So this panel is going to cover environmental issues and energy topics, not just climate change, although we'll occasionally kind of return to that. We have three outstanding panelists here. We have Senator Forrest Knox from Kansas. Senator Knox previously had served as a state representative from 2005 to 2012, and he currently chairs the Joint Committee on Energy and Environment Policy. And by educational background, he's a mechanical engineer. Benita Dodd is the Vice President for the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. She previously was an editorial writer for the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and she directs the Georgia Public Policy Foundation's Center on Environmental Policy. And finally, James Taylor is with the Heartland Institute. He's the managing editor of Environment and Climate News. He's a senior fellow. He's a columnist for Forbes.com. He's an attorney by training. We've been untraining him now for 15 years, 10 years. And he is probably one of the country's most prominent critics of the theory of man-made climate change. So I'd like to begin this conversation with a question to Senator Knox. There's been a big debate in Kansas about renewable portfolio standards. That was a really hot topic this year. I'd love to get a quick overview from you on how that debate went, what your position was, and what the final outcome was.
Thank you, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be here. I have been involved with these before, and certainly appreciate Heartland Institute. My engineering background, when I moved into politics, and I also have an agricultural background, I consider myself somewhat logical, and I found when I moved into the political world that things were a little different there. I think we've already heard today, messaging is everything. I guess this is Confessions of a State Legislator. I don't know how many of you are aware of Sunflower Energy's Holcomb Power Plant. This was early on in my tenure, 9 years ago. Actually, it was 7 years ago, when the governor of Kansas intervened and stopped a coal-fired power plant from being built. That was when the Supreme Court had ruled basically that anything emitted into the atmosphere could be considered a pollutant, and CO2 began to come into consideration right then. And so she overstepped the law as far as I'm concerned and denied on that basis this permit. So we in the legislature, in trying to develop a comprehensive energy plan, and I was very much in the middle of that, put together quite a plan, passed the legislation, actually switched governors, and the governor that came in signed that legislation. Part of that was the RPS that we had in Kansas, so true confessions, one of the worst votes I've ever made, and I was in a position to try to not have that in the package. I live in rural Kansas and began to see lots of wind turbine parts moving the highways, and I had studied this a lot, and I thought, just kind of on the surface, I'm thinking, this is crazy, this makes no economic sense, and I realized they're doing what we told them to do in Kansas. Because if you say you have to have a certain percentage of renewable energy, wind is really the only alternative, certainly in Kansas. And so that's when we began to try to educate the people. And this year we did have legislation in the House. Now I'm on the Senate side, so I kind of spearheaded it there. And basically the end result of that, we made strong arguments in terms of cost. And constituents get it. You know, the problem is everybody loves wind energy. Everybody loves solar energy. That idea is really great. And on the farm I use that in a remote spot, set up solar panels, electric fence for goats. You know, in those sort of situations it makes great sense. Wind energy makes great sense when it's isolated. But when constituents learned that basically 40% of the income of the wind energy companies is direct government subsidies, you know, that tells them a lot. When they began to learn what it's going to cost them and what it is costing them right now to build all this generation, which is, they boast in Kansas, efficiencies are like 50% now, which is very good for wind energy. But that means then that you've got that facility sitting there, it's only being used half the time. And it's only being used when the wind happens to be blowing. So we had a tremendous onslaught of the wind energy lobbying against reducing this RPS, phasing this out, and I personally took the brunt of that, but I had all the facts. But what I found was my colleagues who were in rural areas of Kansas where the economy was actually doing quite well, a lot of that is due to oil and gas and the resurgence in conventional. It was also due to all the wind towers being built. And so it comes down to the answer to all questions of the world of money. And we were seeing short-term investments into a lot of areas of Kansas, rural areas. And so we lost that. The fight is not over though. And my objective is to educate people and try and get them to know the facts and to make rational decisions. So
Do you recommend that legislators in other states attempt to do what you did?
I certainly think the only way, because people, we all have this, renewable energy is a great idea. You know, we have that feeling about things, and basically from an environmental point of view. So you've got to argue facts, and dollars and cents is what it comes down to. And you start talking to constituents, and the trouble is there's a little bit of a disconnect. My constituents are very upset about their increased utility bills. There is no question. That comes up all the time. Well, that's not a direct tax from the government. And so it's a little bit more difficult to put that together and to educate constituents that those prices are, there's costs to them, direct costs, doubling the utility bills in recent years, really. Significant costs are going up for a number of reasons, and it pretty well all comes back to the EPA or renewable energy mandates. It pretty much all comes back to those two things. And people need to recognize that, and that's not the easiest thing. So I do a lot of educating is what I try to do.
Okay. All right, we'll return to wind power maybe a little bit later. My next question is for Benita concerning media coverage of environmental issues. I think we've been kind of struck by what we perceive as inaccurate coverage and maybe biased coverage in the mainstream media. Your background is as a journalist. Why is this happening? Why is it so apparent on this issue, but perhaps less obvious on some other issues?
I think it's basically obvious in just about every issue out there. That the media has a liberal slant, that conservatives, libertarians who argue that technology, that America's technological advances will take care of these problems that we have with pollution, we're seen as Neanderthals. You know, it's all about saving the earth, and it's a really disappointing approach because there's so much science out there that we are not paying attention to. I was reading something yesterday from Walt Cunningham. I don't know if you know him. He was the Apollo 7 astronaut, and there was a great interview that came into my email box yesterday. And he said, we as scientists in that era did not pay attention to what the media said. We led the media. We did not let the media lead us. And he said that it is not the job of scientists to have opinions. It's the job of scientists to do the research. And he was basically talking about the global warming issue. But what's happening with the media, the mainstream media, is that they take these crises, these created crises, and they run with it. And as thoughtful free market people, as thoughtful conservatives, as thoughtful libertarians, as thoughtful scientists, we have these lengthy explanations. And what do they have? Sound bites.
Four-letter headlines.
Exactly. So it's very difficult. It's not going to change. But when you look at all the polls out there, the interesting thing is that the public does not see it as a threat. And that's very important. You know, we need to step beyond the mainstream media, basically, and take our message directly to the public, to constituents, because that is not what they care about. What they care about is job creation. They care about the economy. Why are we not pointing out that when Spain moved to green energy, every green job that they created took away 9 traditional jobs? The German wholesale prices of energy have declined. And so now utilities don't see it as profitable. Why? Because they are requiring the utilities to take in capacity created by all this green energy that they don't need. There's an overcapacity. We have the same issue here in Georgia now. The utilities have enough of a supply, have enough capacity, but they are going to be required to take on more solar energy now. And this is seen as a good thing, as far as the mainstream media is concerned. And yes, don't get me wrong, you know, a variety of approaches in energy is great, but we have to ensure that we have an efficient, reliable, and cost-effective grid out there.
Agreed. So there's been a few articles now in the British media and the German media that's starting to express a lot of skepticism toward wind power and this whole global warming alarmism thing. So ironically, Europe, or maybe not ironically, Europe went first and head first into the global warming scare, and it looks like it's starting to be reversed there. And even their media now is starting to back away from some of the more hysterical claims. So maybe there's hope that U.S. media will turn it around. James Taylor, where does the science on this stuff stand? Is it breaking one way or the other? Have there been recent developments on the science front that should affect this debate?
Well, I'm going to answer that question in just 1 minute. There are a couple of points here I'm going to make.
Go right ahead.
Forrest talked about the electricity prices rising and his constituents being very concerned about that. And that touches on a point that is often missed. And that is when the money comes in to the rural landowners, it's not coming in from out of state, it's not coming in from out of country, it's coming in from the ratepayers in the state. The vast majority of the people in Kansas are paying for the money that's going to a small number of landowners. It's a redistribution of money. It's not creating money. When a wind turbine is placed on some farmer's land, it's a redistribution of money from the many to the few, and from those who are not landowners to those who are, from the less affluent to the more affluent. It's an important point to keep in mind when you are presented with the economic argument for these wind turbines. And Benita talked about the media, how it's hard to get a message through the conventional media. And this is a reason why I'm really enthusiastic about the future of energy policy and environmental policy in this nation. And that is, right now we have far more media options available than we did 30 years ago. And we just had the 3 networks and a few national newspapers. When I'm giving talks in community forums, and let's say I have 30 minutes to talk about the science, and I'm going to have less than 30 minutes here, but whatever I don't fit in, I will inevitably get someone from the audience, usually more than one, that'll raise their hand and say, well, Mr. Taylor, that was a good point, but you forgot to mention this, and you forgot to mention that also supports your point. And the point is, people are able to access, and there are enough people. In America, I believe that the citizens of our nation, we've been a hardworking nation, hardworking citizens forever, and I think we have people who are inquisitive, and people will find the truth. And I think if you stand up for the truth, ultimately, truth will prevail. And the media now makes the truth more accessible. And that really leads us to, where's the science? And the science is emerging regarding global warming, climate change issues that is solidifying and reaffirming the position that we've been taking, because these are the positions that the scientists we're working with are telling us. Most importantly, just in the past few months, Hans von Storch, he is a lead author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's one of the folks that, not only is he a lead author for the IPCC, he's been one of the folks that says, what the IPCC says is correct, we back it up, we're supporting it every way you can think of. But in an interview with Der Spiegel just a month ago, he pointed out that the climate models that the IPCC is relying on when they make the predictions of significant future warming. Those climate models are predicting too much warming today than has occurred. The climate models cannot reproduce the temperatures that have essentially flattened out over the past 15 years. So here we have a lead author for the IPCC saying, the models are not working, we're going to have to revise the models and revise them downward. When the IPCC, when the United Nations says that, that tells us that's very strong evidence that what we've been saying all along is true. Also, just in the past month or two, there was a peer-reviewed study in which satellite data was collected that was measuring foliage throughout the Earth. Now, we've known for decades that as carbon dioxide levels have increased in the atmosphere, as we've had modest warming throughout the planet, that the Earth has greened. But this new analysis studied those areas around the planet that are significantly arid. Not necessarily the desert areas, although the desert areas show the same results, but they were looking at like the Sahel in Africa, which we often hear about. Arid regions, according to the satellite data, are becoming significantly greener as a result of that enhanced atmospheric carbon dioxide. An 11% increase in foliage in these areas that are specifically attributed to carbon dioxide increases. So when people make the argument that global warming is bad, they never point out the benefits of atmospheric carbon dioxide or of warming temperatures. And we're seeing more and more studies showing that. And then finally, as far as developments regarding the science, extreme weather events these are the topics that the alarmists try to put in front of Americans on the TV and the radio and the newspapers, because this is something that can be very scary. Now, they'll report any hurricane or tornado that strikes, but what they don't often report, but people have access to through the new media, is the fact that virtually every extreme weather event, whether it's hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, they're becoming less frequent and less severe, and we have the objective scientific data to back it up. Right now, we're in the longest period in United States history without a major hurricane strike. At the same time, earlier this year, we set a record for the longest period in history without a tornado death. And although we hear a lot about wildfires, the fact of the matter is, going back 40, 50 years, the number of wildfires is actually declining throughout the United States. We have more acres burned because we have a change in policy where the federal government allows wildfires to burn and will only fight them to the extent that they're threatening significantly life and property. But when we look at those hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, and we can move on to whatever extreme weather event you want to bring up, we're seeing across the board an objective documentation of less frequent and less severe extreme weather events.
How about the Arctic? Aren't we melting the Arctic?
Well, if we're going to talk about global warming, global climate change, we have to look at the pole as a whole. And the polar ice caps, actually right now for the vast majority of 2013, we've had more polar ice than has been the case on average since we first launched satellites to measure polar ice in 1979. So we're above the 34-year average. The Arctic has had some recession of ice, but there's been more growth in the Antarctic than there has been receding ice in the Arctic. In fact, just during the months of July and early August, Antarctic sea ice has set a record. I believe it's now 14 days during the past month and a half. We've seen record Antarctic sea ice.
So why do we keep reading newspaper articles about the Arctic opening up, open water in the Arctic? Wasn't that just last week?
Oh, that was wonderful. If you saw this, the Associated Press, they published a photograph that purported to be of the North Pole, and it showed a shallow sea of water. And this was another example of this global warming crisis. But a few things they didn't point out. The buoy on which the camera was situated actually floats around quite a bit and had shifted several hundred miles away from the North Pole. Secondly, even if it had been at the North Pole, it's common for there to be shallow melting where you have an area maybe the size of a couple football fields for about 6 inches or a foot deep of water. That happens all the time. It's happened as far back as people have known. And in fact, we also know that submarines have surfaced at the North Pole where there's been no sea ice going back in the 1950s. But that photograph and that story was not true. It wasn't even the North Pole.
All right. There was another story recently that was projecting that we're going to lose all the ice on the Arctic by 2020 or 2030, I think.
Yeah, and whenever you see projections, this is where the global warming alarmists try to make their cake, try to make their case, try to make their pudding, whatever you want to call it. It's always projections. It's based on some analysis, some model. but it's not based on real-world data or observations. They were making these same projections back 5-10 years ago. They were saying we're going to have an ice-free North Pole by the year 2013. This was the year. And I went online to the folks that were making those claims, and I said, I'll put up $1,000, I'll put up $5,000. I'm not a rich man, but I'll put up whatever I have, and I'll bet my money against yours. You're making a claim. I'll make the bet that in 2013 there will not be an ice-free North Pole. Not a single one of them took me up on that bet. And I make those bets for a variety of global warming topics whenever I see these ridiculous claims. And the funny thing is, the same folks who claim so sincerely that these crises are happening, they have yet to take me up on a single such wager. Tells you something.
Yeah, tells you something. All right. Tell you what, on to a different, slightly different topic, at least fracking. Senator, is fracking an issue in Kansas? Are you guys passing legislation on it?
We actually, I believe last year, passed legislation that allowed the Corporation Commission in Kansas to regulate fracking. It was, in my view, somewhat of a very non-meaningful event. Fracking was developed in Kansas. The first well was fracked in 1947 in western Kansas. It's a procedure that's used regularly in certain kinds of rock. I'm not a geologist, when there's a need, and something that has a long history, something that has never been a problem. Nobody's ever raised issues, and that's evident by the fact that we didn't regulate it, and because we don't really regulate it today, though there was authority given. I think fracking in connection with horizontal drilling, and now horizontal drilling is a new thing, a technology that's developing, and they're reaching deeper and deeper and further out. I think the last I heard, approaching 3 miles down, 3 miles out. Every time I hear about it, it's a greater distance. But I don't believe there's certainly in Kansas no problems that have arisen. There is horizontal drilling going on in Kansas. We are expanding development of conventional energy sources in Kansas very much, wishing that we had more. And fracking is accompanying this in those rock formations where it's useful. It's an economic tool, has had great benefits through all these years. That's why it's used. That's the way business operates. And regulation, I've reluctantly admitted the government, the one thing it does well is regulate. And there are certainly places where you need the government watching over the shoulder. There's a lot of abandoned wells from 50 to 100 years ago in southeast Kansas. That's a big issue for me. And a lot of those things happen because there wasn't the sort of regulation that there should have been. So I'm not against government regulation, but fracking has a long history. There's been no horror stories at all in Kansas, and it's being used in horizontal drilling to great benefit.
All right, we're going to go to Q&A in just a minute, but I wanted to ask about ethanol. Ethanol should be a big deal in Kansas because of the farm community's stake in corn and its role. James, I know you've done some research and writing on ethanol. And Benita, you and I talked briefly about the blending wall that we've reached, that it's going to make it harder and harder for refineries to meet the federal mandate for the number of billions of gallons of ethanol that they're supposed to be using every year. So where does that stand? Is there an effort afoot to repeal some of the federal mandates that are currently in the ethanol industry?
Is that to Benita? Go ahead.
As I understand, the EPA just rejected a request to delay the mandate. But James, perhaps you kept up more with that.
Well, there's an effort in Congress to repeal the ethanol mandate. What's really interesting when you talk about environmental consequences, because ethanol is sold as an environmentally beneficial product. But when you look at the amount of corn and the amount of land that's dedicated to ethanol, it's astonishing. 42% of our nation's corn crop now goes to fuel production rather than food production. And what kind of a dent is it making? Not much. When you look at the amount of land that is being set aside for ethanol corn, it's equivalent to all of the land in Delaware, and all of the land in Connecticut, and all of the land in Rhode Island, and all of the land in Massachusetts, and all of the land in Hawaii, and all of the land in Vermont and all of New Hampshire combined. Now, without the ethanol mandate, some of this land would be utilized to produce corn for food or for other crops for food, but also a lot of this land wouldn't be utilized or wouldn't be developed at all. Much of it is marginal cropland. And when people talk about environmental issues, I know I'm somebody that likes to have a certain amount of the landscape left in a relatively pristine state. Here's a market incentive away from people leaving the land as it is. We talk about how sometimes it's the big bad corporations or the right-wing think tanks that hate the environment or anti-conservationists. It's just the opposite. If we were to utilize market principles here and not have the ethanol mandates, we would see a lot more land conservation than we're seeing right now.
All right. Even the environmental groups now have been coming out saying that on net, increasing use of ethanol doesn't reduce carbon dioxide emissions.
Correct. Most likely, it's pretty close to being an even trade, but most likely the life cycle process for ethanol results in more carbon dioxide emissions than the life cycle process for gasoline.
Benita, do you want to add?
You were talking about the environmental. It's very interesting in here in Georgia, the Tea Party has allied with the environmental activists and have created a new coalition called the Green Tea Coalition. And this to me is really scary. I mean, I am really worried about where the Tea Party is going with this, because we all know that the Tea Party started on limited government principles, and the environmental groups are generally more about government, nanny government taking over. So this is going to be very interesting to watch. And it was this alliance that was working on solar energy, increasing the solar energy here. And what's going to happen now is they're going to fight more of these on private property rights principles. And I don't see how it's going to work, really. But yeah, when you see the Tea Party and the environmental activists get together.
Yeah, on the one hand, that is scary. And it's similar to environmentalists trying to make inroads into the churches and
What would
evangelicals.
Jesus do?
Yeah,
Yes, you're
yeah,
right.
and they get a lot of attention, even though I think they make very little progress. So you got to be careful relying on the mainstream media to tell us how effective environmentalists have been in their outreach to the Tea Party activists.
Exactly.
They'll get 6 guys in a room, and it's a major news story. All right, and Senator,
And
Farm Community.
of course, ethanol, agriculture's main industry in Kansas by far. And of course, these things cut both ways. Now, when I first came into the legislature, I supported trying to promote ethanol from an agricultural point of view. However, what we laid in place phased out. So we have quite a number of ethanol plants in Kansas. The one nearest me has been closed down for a while now, basically because of economics. They're buyers of corn, and when corn prices go sky high. Business figures out those things pretty well. And I'm personally a purchaser of corn, and yet I promote commodities in any way I can. So this cuts both ways. But where you're at in Kansas is the things that we did legislatively are phasing out. We helped these plants get built. We gave them incentives. They're phasing out. So economics is working. I've frankly not heard in terms of federally what's going on here. But I'm seeing picking winners and losers is something that the legislature ought to not be involved in. We've done that in the past. We tried to be smart. Government's not very smart. And government, the thing that's impressed me is government reacts very quickly. I've always thought of government as moving slow and carefully, but it's not true at all. We jump on board because we react to public sentiment. Is what we do, actually. And we try to be the good guys and do good things, and often to bad effect. But the public reacts to the news, to the media, and the media is bringing out the bad news. Okay, they're bringing out the crisis. That's why this global climate change thing sells, And I point out to my constituents, the media is in the business of making money. You need to remember that. And so they're going to do what sells. And we make the mistake of following that in the public sector. And
Forrest's point,
While James is making one additional point, Taylor is going to go around with his microphone. If you have a question to ask, raise your hand and Taylor will find you.
and one additional point that comes to mind is Forrest is talking about Kansas. Another environmental issue, Kansas, your Governor Brownback is very concerned about water, depleting water from the Ogallala aquifer. And it calls to mind an environmental issue that plays out with both fracking and ethanol. Now that the EPA has asserted, EPA former administrator Lisa Jackson's testified under oath more than once, EPA has never found a single instance of fracking causing groundwater pollution. There have been hundreds of wells drilled just in Arkansas. I see our Arkansas contingent found no pollution elsewhere throughout the country. Now the environmental argument against fracking is that it uses so much water. But what's real interesting, when you compare the BTU energy, natural gas versus ethanol, for ethanol to produce the same amount of BTUs as natural gas, as the fracking process, requires 1,000 times more water than the fracking process. So yes, fracking does use some water, and if you throw it out in the number of billions or billions of gallons throughout the nation, it sounds big. But when you compare it to what some of the other folks are saying should be the alternative, if we're really concerned about water, fracking is the way to go.
Great point. All right, first question. Where's Taylor?
Right here, Representative Ed Setzer from Georgia. I was speaking to one of our renewable energy professors at one of our technical universities here in the Atlanta area in the last couple of weeks. We were talking about energy efficiency, particularly in cars. Certainly the federal government's driving energy efficiency standards in a lot of the whole range of new automobiles year by year. He raised the question, though, that in Europe, they have a lot higher energy efficiency in their cars. They're able to get more miles per gallon because in the United States, we have much more rigorous standards on particulates that come from the emissions of our cars. And because America regulates particulates much more rigorously than even Europe does, Europe has much more fuel economy in their cars than we do. Is that being considered, and is there any way, as we try to drive towards more fuel-efficient standards, to look at our particulate standards, maybe ease up on those some, so that we can achieve some energy efficiency opportunities?
It's been a couple of years since I looked at the issue, but I know clean diesel technology was a big deal just a few years ago. And this new generation of diesel engines presumably meet the new particulate standards from EPA. So at least a couple of years ago, they were predicting that we would see a rejuvenation or regeneration of diesel-fueled passenger cars in the United States. But it's been a while since I've tried to follow the issue. Any of you know anything about it?
That's really interesting that you mentioned that, how Europe's standards are lower than ours and they get higher efficiency from their cars. When you look at the debate throughout the nation on coal, for instance, we don't want to use coal here because we don't want the pollution. What do? We send it off to China. We send it off to Germany. We send it off to Europe. We send it off to England. And they don't have the same standards that we have. We don't want to drill here in our national parks. What do? We accept the fact that Nigeria and all the other countries are out there drilling, and they don't have the same standards that we have regulating the industry. So what we're doing by using the fuel from other countries is actually being irresponsible as opposed to drilling, exploring, fracking right here. And we lose the argument a lot because of the sound bites, as I said. What does Matt Damon say? We need to examine fracking. We need to analyze this to make sure that it's safe. We've been doing fracking for over 100 years. The inventor of fracking died, I think, at age 91, 2 weeks ago. But our responsibility here is to promote the fact that we need more energy security and energy responsibility. We can't talk about energy independence because energy is a global economy.
Getting to your point about rolling back the standards, Ronald Reagan said very famously that the closest thing to eternity is a government program once started. And I would say that applies double to these emissions restrictions or whatever pollution standards are in place, even when we present science that shows that we're going way overboard and spending way too much money We're not getting, the cost-benefit analysis doesn't work, the amount that we're spending for just a little bit of pollution reduction, especially when we don't see any health benefits. So it's certainly worth fighting for. And that's one of the topics I'm not very optimistic on, and I'm very optimistic on a lot of energy and environmental issues. But we do produce, through Environment and Climate News, our monthly publication, through our policy studies, we do our best to produce the facts and show that, like you say, we're restricting emissions much more even than the European Union. And Benita, you mentioned Matt Damon. I am scheduled to have a lengthy interview with him next month where he is going to be quizzing me about various environmental issues, so I'll have fun with that. Send me any questions you want to throw back at him.
Wow, very good. All right, I should just quickly mention there's a difference between miles per gallon and efficiency, and we didn't make that distinction in this conversation. It's a kind of big deal with the auto manufacturers, and Europe's mix of vehicles is very different from those in the United States. We have big distances, there's a lot of differences, so these international comparisons are kind of tricky.
The vehicles are very small.
Yep. Next question, right here.
Thank you. Paige Olson, I work with Representative Taylor here in Georgia. Two quickies. There have been some disturbing images, especially in the New York Times this past week, over the air apocalypse in China. And I just want to see if any of you have a comment about the extremeness of the pictures, at least that I saw, and how it affects not only the folks living there, but also all of their other economic, there are ways of making money in terms of tourism and such. And then secondly, what is your opinion of America's overconsumptive behavior? I was just in Europe where you're reminded all the time, please turn the lights out, electricity's very expensive here, be mindful. So the issue in China, and then also just our natural behavior to be consuming so much energy.
Well, I have a son in China right now. I've been paying attention to China for some time now. Mainly, I like to quote the numbers of coal-fired power plants that are coming online every month in China. But I certainly think this is a problem there. It harkens back. I was in Philadelphia last month. I remember the history of the pollution in Philadelphia in the early times in our country. And we certainly don't want to go there. I think the point that I would make is these are countries that are developing economically, and they're making decisions based on that. Those stories look pretty bad. It is bad. The water pollution and the air pollution is bad. There's no question. At the same time, what's going on there is doing many good things for the lives of Chinese. Elevating their standard of living. You've got to look at the whole picture. And I guess the point I would make is this: we're doing great things here. I don't think any one of us here is wanting to knock having a clean environment. Not at all. But we've seen a cost in the past 2 or 3 decades, a cost of cleaning up and making sure our air is clean here. And we're poised at making new steps where you're going to see a tremendous cost and very little benefit. And so what I would do is compare America to there. Of course, I live in Kansas, free clean air where I am. And say, are we willing to cripple our economy? And that's exactly what they're doing. They're not willing to cripple their economy, and they're paying a price. And it is a price. There's no question. So,
Benita?
I'm from South Africa, and I understand what a difference income and wealth makes in your standard of living and your attention to the environment. We're debating whether we need solar or nuclear or coal-fired plants and natural gas and more fracking. They're debating how to keep the candle lit at night in South Africa. It's such a difference, and yet what we're trying to do, especially when you bring up the United Nations, what are we trying to do? We're trying to impose these immensely costly standards on developing nations that are still trying to figure out how to turn on the lights, let alone alternative energy.
But a global solution to the global warming problem requires that we reduce emissions from developing countries. Why not skip a generation of technology and go right to clean sources of energy?
Who's going to pay for that?
And it doesn't work.
Other than that, I think it's a good.
Thermodynamics was my favorite subject in engineering school, and that's the other thing I like to point out to people. It doesn't work. It's low quality energy. It's very expensive energy to develop, and there are places where it's needed, but not in the developed world. And you're looking at changing life as we know it in the West, is what you're doing, to move that direction. There really are no answers if you look to the end. It cannot be done. I read an article in Time magazine. How many of you guys read the 10 questions at the end? Sometimes they're really good. And James Dyson, I decided maybe I need to buy a Dyson vacuum cleaner. And aerodynamics, that's his life. He loves this stuff. And they asked him, so why aren't you big on wind energy? His answer was, you can cover the United Kingdom with wind turbines and provide 15% of the energy needed for the nation. And that's why.
It's interesting regarding China. First of all, you have a lot more people that are in a much smaller place, much smaller space. At the same time, you have lower restrictions, lower standards for their power plants. So what's happening here is as we make energy more expensive here and we chase businesses overseas because of that, ironically, we're making things worse environmentally when we look at the planet as a whole, because now they're going to China where it's less expensive to operate, and yet you have more of the pollution resulting from that.
So you're saying that population density in China is higher than in the United States?
Yes, indeed. But anyway, getting to the next point, which is regarding overconsumption. A few things to keep in mind. According to the EPA, the 6 principal pollutants that they track, emissions have declined by 70% during the past 30 years. So we're doing a pretty good job. Greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide. The United States is reducing carbon dioxide emissions faster than the European Union. In fact, we're leading the world in terms of the pace of our carbon dioxide emissions reduction. So we're doing pretty well then. And then finally, when it gets to imperatives to say turn off the lights, make sure you're diligent about that, it calls to mind attention, because we have a price signal. And when the price of energy is lower, then we're not going to be as diligent about turning off the lights every time we leave the room, because there's really no need to do so economically. Now, it could be said, well, then let's either jack up the price of energy or make it more scarce. But we have to understand that affordable energy really is the backbone of a healthy economy. Without it, our economy is toast. And you can go back over decades and track U.S. unemployment rates and compare it to energy prices, and you'll see a much closer correlation than you will between carbon dioxide and global temperatures. So I would argue that we don't really. I mean, it'd be nice if everyone turned off the lights when they left a room every time. But energy right now, we have enough of it. It's affordable enough, and that's the way it should be. And that might be a little side effect that we wish people would improve upon. But the alternatives would, I think, make things much worse.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, I guess first and foremost, I have to thank James, because you gave me my takeaway from the session, which is place bets with global warming alarmists on their projections as a get-rich-quick scheme. So, and it worked. But recently, a lot of folks know in the room, Georgia's Public Service Commission had their vote on the solar energy capacity of some of our distributors and providers in Georgia, and specifically saying 550 additional megawatts of power shall be generated from solar energy in the energy mix that Georgia Power has here in the state of Georgia. So they didn't call it a renewable portfolio standard because that's not what they called it. So therefore it was not a renewable portfolio standard. By definition, it was a solar energy mandate. And AFP, we started a Keep the Lights On in Georgia project, which essentially talking about messaging, trying to come up with the reliability issue that this might present over time, which is teenage girls with their cell phones not being able to work, and their green cars not being able to charge up at night. And it was made some funny stuff about that. But my question is actually about the use of solar, because one of the commissioners said in this debate that by providing more solar to the energy mix, we would be able to hedge against some of the energy agenda that the administration is putting forward. They didn't give specifics on that, but that was one of the implications that came out in the debate from the supporters, is that if we provide more of this to our energy mix, we'll be able to hedge against some of the regulations that may be coming through the administration, through the energy agenda that's been put forth here recently. How would you respond to some of that?
It sounds like what they're saying is the administration may jack up the price of electricity so high that even solar power, which is far and away the most expensive source of electricity today, may someday be less expensive. What I would take from that is, number one, that we should fight like heck against the ever-tightening noose on our energy supply and energy prices. Second, even with the Obama administration, and didn't start with him, it goes back a long way for the collectivists and the anti-energy folks, even with all their efforts, wind power, solar power, a few isolated instances for wind power, but by and large, wind power, solar power have always been substantially more expensive than conventional energy alternatives. And we discussed fracking earlier, and we didn't really talk much about how fracking has just, it's revolutionized energy. It's revolutionized not only the technologies, but the amount of energy that we now have access to. It's amazing. If we go back 15, 20 years ago, during the Clinton administration, we were told that we needed to go to natural gas for environmental reasons. And the price of natural gas was so much higher then than it is now before the fracking revolution. And we were told that the environmental benefits were worth it. Now that was comparing the price of natural gas to coal. It's still a higher price than coal, but at least it's relatively cost comparable. It's getting closer. But the fact of the matter is, even before the fracking revolution, when natural gas prices were high and they spiked even higher, partially as a result of those policies during the Clinton administration, still, even then, so much more expensive than they are today, natural gas prices, even then, were substantially less expensive than wind or solar. So this argument, as you put it, I'm from Florida, that's where I live. We're often told that our agriculture commissioner oversees energy policy there. And I've had meetings with him. He says, well, we have to have a diverse portfolio because the prices of coal and natural gas might spike. I say, show me one time, that's all. Don't show me on average, just show me one time, even for a day, that natural gas and coal power were more expensive than wind and solar. If you could show me a single day, I'll buy into it. It's never happened. It's never going to happen. Not in our lifetimes anymore.
Sounds like a subset of the argument that it's inevitable that we have to expand our reliance on renewable energy. And so we might as well start now, we might as well get a lead on it, we might as well develop some economic benefit from moving in this direction. And I think the answer to that is it's definitely not inevitable. I think that's what the fracking and horizontal drilling revolutions have demonstrated. I remember Jimmy Carter got us into coal, slightly older than James. And so the politicians are always worried about the future energy supply and always think we need a national energy policy. And they're always 10 years late and a dollar short on the solutions. So I think we've got time, and we're not going to discuss the inherent characteristics of solar and wind that make them intermittent and high cost and unreliable. But at the end of the day, a good engineer knows this stuff. The other side admits that there are very big capacity restrictions on moving in that direction. We're going to rely on fossil fuels for another 100 years or 200 years. And when a transition occurs, it's going to be because there is genuinely a better, more cost-effective fuel that's made available. And it's going to be nuclear or something that's not currently on the table.
One thing to remember, anytime you build wind or you build solar, either of those, you've got to back them up, and invariably you're backing them up with natural gas these days. And so I know a week ago or so there was a news release of how much wind energy had been built, and that was the sector of energy that was increasing the greatest. But if you looked, natural gas was actually number one in terms of energy, because you can't build either solar or wind without having the ability. And I don't know in Georgia whether you have a lot of natural gas-fired production already. And if you do, that's pretty handy. That means the price of electricity is very high here for the gas, even now, even with low natural gas prices. But we have tremendous production of natural gas right now. In my area, it's coal bed methane, okay? And the prices are so low, it doesn't pay to produce it. But I'm predicting if we keep moving ahead with renewable energy, that gas prices are gonna go up because demand is gonna have to go up.
Behind every windmill is a natural gas well. Question over here.
Can I just add one quick point? Joe, you mentioned Jimmy Carter, I mentioned Barack Obama. I think it's only fair and appropriate that we not just limit it to Democrats and point out George W. Bush, how are those fuel cells working out for you? Arnold Schwarzenegger, how's that hydrogen highway working out for you? It's not just Democrats, it's not along party lines, and it's something that we need to be, conscious of, regardless of whether, someone hangs an RRD after their name.
I agree. Richard Nixon created EPA. So God bless Richard Nixon. All right, next question.
This will be our final question.
Representative David Meeks from Arkansas, and fracking is a big deal, especially where I'm at with the Fayetteville shale play and everything. And that kind of boils into my question here, and that is, we are now trying to build an infrastructure, gas stations, fueling stations for natural gas vehicles. And I would like the panel to kind of talk about that, because, if free market, we're trying not to pick winners and losers, but we are trying to gain energy independent from the Middle Eastern oil. And how do you balance that out with policy about moving forward with building an infrastructure for vehicles, giving rebates to convert vehicles from gasoline to natural gas to try to boost the natural gas industry, because it is, it is American. We're producing American jobs by doing that. It is a huge economy boost in Arkansas as well as Kansas. So if the panel could kind of weigh those things out, talk about that.
This is something that I've given thought to, especially in my area. I'd like to have a market, a local market for natural gas. And an area that I'd have to make a decision, I guess, as to what the government's role is there. Based on my history, we jump into things so quickly. It has to make business sense, is the bottom line. And I don't know how you're doing it. I know I was in Oklahoma, and I was surprised to see natural gas fueling stations. You've got to have that. You've got to build that infrastructure. At the same time, you've got to have demand for it. The natural thing in my mind is local governments. In my rural Kansas area, if the school boards in the area, if the county and the city governments would decide, because if you're going to fuel with natural gas, you don't have nearly the range. Okay, so it lends itself to local driving, and so there are some bad things about it. The good things are it's a lot cheaper. And so those market forces need to be in place. I'm not opposed to the government stepping in, trying to do what it can to facilitate, but it's pretty well going to have to be large businesses that run a fleet in an area or local government that is going to have to be involved in that, as far as I can see pushing that forward.
I was talking to somebody recently about this who said that it would start with the freeways, and some of the big trucking companies are already going to natural gas on their fleets. So you'll have gas stations along all the major freeways in the next 5 years without subsidy, without regulation, and then it spreads from there. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I think as a libertarian, I look at issues like this and I say, what's the barrier to private solutions to this problem? Well, where are the barriers? How come companies can't solve this problem by themselves? And if there are barriers, then let's see what government can do to get rid of the barriers. But you don't approach it from how can we help this? Because there's no limit to how government can help virtually anything. And so the only limit is how much money we've got. So I think that's how I would approach it. Any other comments on this? Go ahead.
The interesting thing is that while we might be resisting this expensive move to renewables, the federal government has made a commitment to get 20% of its energy by 2020 from renewables. So one way or another, we're paying for it.
And I'm also excited about potential for natural gas vehicles. What's really interesting and what surprised me is in my conversations with folks in the natural gas industry is that their greatest concern isn't getting help from the government. It's what's impeding them right now is their fear that EPA is going to step in and either restrict, eliminate fracking, or make it so expensive that it's no longer worthwhile. And that's what they're concerned about. If they had certainty that EPA isn't going to go in and follow the whole system up, I think just utilizing market forces, they dive right in. That's what I'm told at least.
Very good. All right, round of applause for the panelists. Thank you very much. Here's John Noder.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a great panel. We're going to take about 35-minute break. So once you're supposed to start for 12, we may be a couple minutes after that, just so the staff can clear off the table and set the salads and stuff. So I'm sure our speakers will be around, but reconvene around 12:05. So thank you so much.